I'm Geoff Wild from the Department of Mathematics at the University of Western Ontario. My institution is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape'wuk, and the Chinooktun peoples. I'd like to discuss how the vertical transmission of a disease affects the coevolution of pathogens and their hosts. The work I'll discuss was carried out by a graduate student in my group, George Shilcock, and in collaboration with my colleague Francisco Ubeda at Royal Holloway, University of London. Vertical transmission of a pathogen occurs when it's passed from an infected parent to that parent's offspring. For example, during pregnancy. Significant examples of vertically transmitted human diseases include those caused by the torch group of pathogens, a group that includes HIV, Zika virus, herpes virus, and rubella. Vertical transmission is predicted to influence the evolutionary forces that shape the virulence of an infectious disease. By virulence, I mean the negative effects of infection experienced by a host. Generally speaking, the ability to transmit vertically is expected to align the interests of a pathogen and its host, and ultimately lead to the evolution of lower virulence. That said, some vertically transmitted pathogens are associated with highly virulent infections. Of course, without vertical transmission, the situation could be worse. Still, the observation suggests we might wish to reconsider our expectations surrounding vertical transmission. Another reason to reconsider our expectations comes from theory. Models that predict vertical transmission drives virulence down neglect possible evolutionary responses of the host. Given that vertical transmission raises the stakes for the host, we might actually expect vertical transmission to spark an arms race and ultimately exacerbate the negative effects associated with an infectious disease. It was really this last point that motivated our group and led us to ask, where does selection lead coevolutionary trajectories of pathogens and their hosts when infections can be passed from parent to offspring? To answer our question, we studied a standard model from mathematical epidemiology. We tracked numbers of hosts who are uninfected but susceptible to infection, represented by the big S on the left. We also tracked the number of hosts that are infected by the pathogen, represented by the big I on the right. Hosts in the model move from susceptible to infected because of horizontal transmission events. For example, they're sneezed on by an infected neighbor. Hosts move from infected to susceptible when they recover. Hosts also experience death, represented by the arrows at the bottom of the slide. Infected individuals experience a slightly higher rate of death, owing to their disease status. The population of hosts is replenished by births. Offspring produced by infected parents acquire their parent's infection with some probability, here represented as V. In this case, they enter the population already in the infected state. To move from this epidemiological model to an evolutionary one, we introduce trade-offs. For the pathogen, the cost of increasing its horizontal transmission rate is an increase in the infection-induced death rate it imposes on its host. To emphasize this, I've colored both rates in blue. An important side note, we assume vertical transmission is independent of the infection-induced death rate. For the host, the cost of increased recovery is a reduction in its overall birth rate while infected. To emphasize this, I've colored both rates in red. Combining the trade-offs and the epidemiological dynamics with some dynamical systems theory, we arrive at mathematical descriptions for the action of selection on the pathogen's infection-induced death rate and the host's recovery rate. We used our mathematical description to predict the long-term behavior of coevolutionary trajectories over evolutionary time. On this slide, I've represented these trajectories as squiggly black lines. We found that, under some circumstances, traits, or rather the level at which traits were expressed, acted as attractors to draw trajectories ever closer to evolutionary equilibrium, represented here as a solid and colored horizontal line. Under other circumstances, traits repelled evolutionary trajectories, represented as dashed and colored horizontal lines. Note that repellers act as a threshold of sorts. They repel trajectories, sending them either to a relatively benign state or to a relatively escalated one. The main goal of our model analysis is to determine how these horizontal lines move up or down as the probability of vertical transmission is varied. In other words, we study plots like the ones shown here. These plots explicitly track how the heights of those horizontal lines change as we adjust the probability of vertical transmission between 0 and 1. Sometimes we find that raising the probability of vertical transmission leads to lower infection-induced mortality and lower recovery rates, a more peaceful coevolutionary outcome, for lack of a better word. In some cases, raising the probability of vertical transmission leads to higher infection-induced mortality and higher recovery rates, a more aggressive coevolutionary outcome, again for lack of a better word. In some cases, we get a mix, meaning that raising the probability of vertical transmission leads to lower infection-induced mortality, but higher recovery rates. Interestingly, raising the probability of vertical transmission never leads the pathogen to escalate, while the host de-escalates. To probe further, it helps if we rearrange the contingency table. We'll take the blocks 1, 2, 3 and place them side by side so they form a continuum between mutual de-escalation on the left to mutual escalation on the right. Where our predictions about the effect of vertical transmission land on this continuum change depending on how we've adjusted other model parameters. For instance, when we raise the cost of recovery for the host, model predictions tend to cluster nearer the de-escalated end of the continuum. This makes sense. As recovery becomes more expensive, a host will shy away from an aggressive response to an infection. We also found that a greater intrinsic rate of increase for the host population tips the balance in favor of de-escalation. We make sense of this by equating a high intrinsic rate of increase to the profitability of vertical transmission. A high intrinsic rate of increase implies the pathogen can spread more easily through vertical transmission. And if vertical transmission does the host less harm, as we've assumed, de-escalation seems natural. On the opposite side, we find the profitability of horizontal transmission. Recall that the pathogen improves its horizontal transmissibility by investing in harming its host. As we raise the rate of return on this investment, coevolution tends to produce mutually escalated outcomes more readily. My aim with this slide is to show you that our findings translate to situations where we study actual measures of virulence and the relationship these measures share with the probability of vertical transmission. The top panels of the figure show virulence as it might be understood by a public health official. Virulence in those panels is captured by the probability that an infected host dies as a result of its infection. The bottom panels show virulence measured instead as the actual reduction in fitness experienced by an infected host. If you focus for the moment on just the black curves, you'll notice that they don't always decrease as vertical transmission becomes more likely. In fact, the lower left panels show examples where virulence measures are strictly increasing with vertical transmission. If you now focus on the purple curves, you'll see that, once again, a reduction in virulence is associated with a higher intrinsic rate of population growth for the host. Note, the lightest purple corresponds to a higher intrinsic rate of increase and a lower virulence. If you focus now on the orange curves, you'll see that, once again, virulence increases as the harm a pathogen inflicts on its host translates more efficiently to increases in horizontal transmission. Note here that the darker orange corresponds to the higher ROI on harm and higher virulence. Finally, if you move your eye across panels from left to right, you see that, once again, a reduction in virulence is associated with increasing cost of recovery. This is most easily seen by focusing on the black curves that drop in height from left panels to right panels. In closing, I'll reiterate that we built a model for pathogen-host coevolution that allowed for vertical transmission of infections. In other words, transmission from parent to offspring. In contrast to widely held expectations, we found that increased rates of vertical transmission do not always select for lower virulence. The nature of the trade-off faced by either party, pathogen or host, will influence the coevolutionary outcome. How costly is it to respond? What is the ROI on harm? In addition, host life history features, especially reproductive rate, matter. With that, I'll mention to you that you can get more details in the near future as our work is set to appear soon in Evolution Letters. You can also contact me directly if you're interested in learning more. I want to thank my co-authors for their hard work on this, NSERC of Canada for funding, and you for your kind attention.